James Reed squinted against the autumn sun as his rental car crunched over the gravel driveway. 15 years since he'd last seen this place, not since he was 12 when his parents decided city life would offer better opportunities. Now at 27 with a graphic design degree gathering dust and termination papers from his Boston firm, still fresh in his pocket, the irony wasn't lost on him. The city had chewed him up and spat him out, and here he was crawling back to the place his parents had been so eager to escape. The white farmhouse needed paint. The red barn leaned slightly to the left, and the fields stretched endlessly under an October sky streaked with high, thin clouds. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. The enormity of what he had inherited, and the 6-month obligation attached to it, settled on his shoulders as he stepped out of the car inheritance letter, crumpled in one hand, duffel bag in the other. Movement caught his eye. A pickup truck, blue and rusted, speeding away from the back of the property, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the service road. Strange. He wasn't expecting anyone else to be here. The farmhouse doors swung open with a familiar creak. His Uncle Max appeared on the porch, face already twisted with displeasure. He'd been living here since grandfather Raymond died 3 months ago, managing the property, while the lawyers sorted everything out. His work boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, and James could smell cigarettes and motor oil on his clothes, the same scent he remembered from childhood. "So you actually came. Figured you'd just sell from the city like all the other inheritance brats." Max's eyes, the same gray as James's father's, narrowed with something between contempt and wariness. James adjusted his grip on the bag. "The will says I have 6 months to decide. I thought I'd spend some time here first." Max spat into the dirt. "There's nothing for you here, kid. This place needs work. You city folks don't understand. Real work. Dirty work." He gestured toward the barn with a calloused hand. "That old building's ready to fall down. The tractor's busted, and winter's coming. You'll be back in Boston before Thanksgiving." Something in his tone made James want to prove him wrong. Grandfather Raymond had left him this place for a reason, and he intended to find out what that was. Besides, with his apartment lease terminated and his bank account dwindling, he had nowhere else to go. The farmhouse felt hollow without Grandfather Raymond's presence. His coffee mug still sat by the kitchen sink, and his worn flannel shirts hung in the bedroom closet like ghosts of a life James had only glimpsed during summer visits. He'd taken the small guest room upstairs, giving Max space to continue his routine while he figured things out. James ran his fingers along the wooden dresser, remembering how his grandfather would sit him on his knee and tell stories about the farm, about the generations of Reeds who had worked this land before them. What would the old man think of him now, a failed graphic designer with an eviction notice and a pink slip retreating to the very life his parents had rejected? The floorboards creaked under his weight as he unpacked his meager belongings. Through the window he could see Max stalking toward the barn, keys jangling in his hand, shoulders hunched against the wind. There was something furtive in his movements, something that didn't sit right. Later that evening, while searching for clean towels in the bathroom cabinet, James found a crumpled piece of paper stuffed behind the pipes. Curious, he smoothed it out on the counter. It was a bank statement in Max's name, showing an account dangerously in the red, followed by a handwritten note with figures and a list of items labeled only with codes. A17, Hassom, P22, BR05. Each with dollar amounts beside of them. At the bottom, a name Whitaker with a Chicago phone number. The first week passed in a blur of repair attempts and frustrating conversations with Max. Every suggestion James made was met with dismissal. Every question answered with condescension. When I asked about the farm's finances, he'd wave me off. When I mentioned updating some of the equipment, he would laugh. "Your grandfather was old school," Max would say. "Didn't trust banks, didn't trust computers, didn't trust much of anything modern, just worked the land the way his daddy did." But the torn documents James had found in the trash told a different story. Printouts of emails between Max and someone named Whitaker discussing acquisitions and private collections. References to authenticity certificates and anonymous buyers. None of it made sense for a struggling farm operation. James spent his days exploring the property, reacquainting himself with childhood memories. The old oak tree where he'd built a treehouse still stood tall. The creek that ran along the eastern border babbled the same song he remembered. But everything felt different, older, more fragile. The barn drew his attention most. Max was right, it did need work. The roof had several loose shingles and some of the siding had warped with age. But there was something about the structure that fascinated him. Perhaps because grandfather Raymond had spent so much time there. James found himself walking around it in the evenings studying its construction, imagining the decades of harvest it had sheltered. Little did he know that beneath his feet lay secrets that would change everything. By the third week, James had established something resembling a routine. Coffee at dawn, morning chores, what few Max would let him do, afternoons exploring the property, evenings reading his grandfather's old farming journals by lamplight. The journals were fascinating detailed records of crop rotations, weather patterns, and local gossip dating back 40 years. But it was what wasn't in the journals that started to puzzle him. There were gaps, whole months missing from certain years. And whenever grandfather Raymond mentioned the barn in his entries, the writing became oddly formal, almost coded. Barn maintenance completed as planned, structural adjustments proceeding smoothly, foundation work successful. Foundation work. The barn sat on a simple concrete pad, nothing fancy. What kind of foundation work could he have meant? James mentioned this to Max over dinner, but he just shrugged. Your grandfather was always tinkering with something, probably just replacing a beam or fixing the floor. That night, James dreamed about the barn. In the dream, he could hear his grandfather's voice calling to him from somewhere below ground. But when he tried to find him, the floorboards beneath his feet turned to quicksand. He woke with a start, moonlight streaming through his bedroom window. The dream had felt so real he could still hear the echo of his grandfather's voice. Unable to shake the feeling, he dressed quietly and stepped outside. The barn stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and for just a moment, James could have sworn he saw a light flickering in one of the windows. But when he blinked, there was only darkness and the sound of autumn wind through the eaves. Max's behavior grew stranger as the days passed. James would catch him watching from the kitchen window when he walked near the barn, and he'd quickly look away when their eyes met. He started locking the barn doors at night, something grandfather Raymond never did according to the journal entries. One evening, James positioned himself in the upstairs window with a pair of binoculars he'd found in his grandfather's closet. Max entered the barn around 10 p.m. and didn't emerge for 2 hours. When he finally did, he was carrying a large canvas bag that definitely hadn't been there when he went in. Whatever was hidden in that barn, Max was systematically removing it. The next morning over coffee, Max seemed unusually animated. Been thinking, city boy, you're not cut out for this life, never will be. I'm willing to buy your half of this place, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else. James studied his uncle's face. How much? Max named a figure that made James nearly choke on his coffee. Less than a third of what the property was worth, even in its current condition. Why would you want this place if it's such a money pit? Sentimental value. Grew up here, same as your father. Difference is I stuck around, learned from the old man. He trusted me with this place, not some city kid who hasn't calloused his hands in 15 years. I'll think about it, James replied, though he had no intention of selling. Max's sudden interest only deepened his suspicions. James needed more information, and he knew just where to start. The next day, he drove into town, finding his way to the local diner where his grandfather used to take him for chocolate milkshakes after helping in the fields. The bell jingled as he pushed open the door, and the scent of coffee and fresh pie enveloped him. Mrs. Garcia, who ran the place, recognized him instantly. Her silver-streaked hair was tied back in the same bun she'd worn 15 years ago, though her face had a few more lines. James Reed, as I live and breathe, your grandfather's boy. She enfolded him in a warm hug that smelled of cinnamon and dish soap. I heard you inherited the farm. About time someone brought some life back to that place. She slid a cup of coffee across the counter without being asked exactly how he liked it, black with 1 sugar. Raymond always said you'd come back someday, said the land would call to you same as it did to him. James wrapped his hands around the warm mug. Did he come here often? Mrs. Garcia's eyes twinkled. Every Saturday morning, regular as clockwork, sat right there at the corner booth drinking coffee and talking with the other farmers. She leaned in, voice dropping, conspiratorially. Your grandfather was so proud of you, always talking about his smart grandson in the big city. He had big plans for that farm, you know. What kind of plans? She glanced around, though the diner was nearly empty. He never said exactly, but he was always working on some project, buying supplies in town, hauling things out to that barn. Your Uncle Max was mighty interested in whatever it was. James felt a chill run up his spine. What kind of supplies? All sorts. Preservation materials from the hardware store. Display cases from the old museum when it closed down. Even had specialized lighting installed. Hank from the electric company did the work. Said it was for his collection, but never would say what he was collecting. On his way back to the farm, James stopped at the hardware store where the owner, Bill Henderson, remembered his grandfather well. Raymond Reed, best customer I ever had. Always needed something unusual. Archival boxes, special grade wood dehumidifiers. Said he was preserving family heirlooms, but must have been quite the collection. Your uncle's been in a few times too, selling some of the equipment back. Said it was taking up too much space. The pieces were starting to fit together, though the picture they formed made little sense. What could his grandfather have been collecting that required such specialized equipment? And why would Max be selling it off back at the farm? James noticed Max's truck was gone. A note on the kitchen table said he'd be back late. Supply run to the county seat. This was his chance to get a closer look at the barn. The new padlock gleamed in the afternoon sun, heavy-duty and impossible to pick with his limited skills. James circled the structure, looking for another way in. The windows were too high to reach without a ladder, and the side door was secured with the same type of lock. Frustrated, he was about to give up when he noticed something odd about one of the ground-level ventilation grates. It seemed looser than the others. Kneeling, he pulled at the grate. It resisted at first, then came away in his hands, revealing a small opening, barely large enough to squeeze through. Taking a deep breath, he pushed his backpack in first, then wriggled his way into the musty darkness of the barn. Inside, his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. Everything looked normal at first: hay bales stacked against the walls, old farming equipment covered with tarps, tools hanging from wooden pegs. But as he moved deeper into the space, he noticed irregularities. There were drag marks in the dirt floor and several areas where the ground seemed disturbed. Some of the hay bales had been moved recently. He could tell because the dust pattern underneath didn't match the outlines above. James started moving bales, checking behind them, looking for anything unusual. Most revealed nothing but more dirt floor and the occasional mouse nest. He was about to give up when he noticed that one of the tractors hadn't collected nearly as much dust as the others. Examining it closer, he realized it had been moved recently, its wheels leaving faint tracks in the dirt. Before he could investigate further, the sound of tires on gravel made his heart leap into his throat. Max was back early. James quickly replaced the hay bales he'd moved and slipped back through the ventilation grate, carefully positioning it behind him. He'd barely made it to the porch when Max's truck rounded the corner. That evening, a tense silence hung over the dinner table. Max seemed agitated, repeatedly checking his phone and stepping outside to make calls. When he returned from one such call, his eyes narrowed at James. "You been in town, talking to people?" James kept his expression neutral. "Just getting to know the area again. Met Mrs. Garcia at the diner. She remembers grandfather." Max's knuckles whitened around his fork. "People in this town talk too much. Don't believe everything you hear." Later that night, James was awakened by the sound of footsteps in his room. He lay still, eyes barely open, watching Max's silhouette move toward his desk, rifling through the papers there. The journals. He was looking at the farming journals. After a few minutes, Max seemed to find what he was looking for and quietly slipped out of the room. In the morning, James checked the journals and found several pages had been torn out, all entries from the summer 3 years ago. What had been on those pages that Max didn't want him to see? The next day, when he returned from a walk to the creek, James found something disturbing on the windshield of his car. A note written in block letters: "Leave the past buried or join it." The paper fluttered in his hand, a knot forming in his stomach. This was no longer just about inherited property or family tension. Something dangerous was happening, and he was getting close to uncovering it. That afternoon, James drove back to town, this time with a specific destination in mind. Mrs. Garcia had mentioned his grandfather was a regular at the diner, which meant she might know more than she'd initially shared. The lunch rush was over, and Mrs. Garcia was wiping down tables when he entered. Her smile faded as she saw his expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." James placed the threatening note on the counter. "Someone left this on my car. I think Max doesn't want me looking into whatever grandfather was working on." Mrs. Garcia's eyes widened. She glanced toward the kitchen and lowered her voice. Your grandfather came to me about a month before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should give you something. Wait here. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a sealed envelope yellowed with age. I promised I'd only give this to you, and only if you came asking questions. James's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was an old-fashioned key attached to a faded leather tag and a letter written in his grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. James, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've started to notice things aren't right at the farm. The key opens the original lock to the barn's side door, the one with the horseshoe above it. Max doesn't know about this key. What lies beneath supports what stands above. Our history is not ours alone to possess. Contact Dr. Sarah Running Bear at the number below. She knows everything about the project and can help you protect what I've spent 30 years building. Trust her as I did, grandfather. Below was a phone number with an area code James didn't recognize. Who's Dr. Running Bear, James asked. Mrs. Garcia shook her head. Raymond mentioned her a few times. Some kind of professor or expert who visited the farm. They were working on a project together. Something about the land's history. That's all I know. Back in his car, James immediately tried the number, but a recorded message informed him it had been disconnected. A quick internet search on his phone for Dr. Sarah Running Bear returned several results. An archaeology professor at the State University, author of papers on indigenous artifacts and ethical preservation methods. Most interestingly, he found a journal article co-authored by R. Reed and S. Running Bear titled Preservation Protocols for Agricultural Land with Historical Significance. His grandfather, the simple farmer, had been publishing academic papers. The Raymond Reed he remembered had been practical, hardworking, and kind, but never scholarly. This added another layer to the mystery. James returned to the farm with renewed determination. The key burned in his pocket as he waited for another opportunity to explore the barn. He got his chance the next morning when Max announced he needed to drive to the feed store in the next county. Once Max's truck disappeared down the driveway, James headed straight for the barn's side door, the one with the rusted horseshoe nailed above it. Heart pounding, he inserted the key, but it wouldn't turn. Examining the lock closer, he realized why. It had been replaced with a newer model. The key in his grandfather's letter was useless. Frustrated but undeterred, James circled the barn looking for another way in. The ventilation grate he'd used before seemed like his best option. He had just removed it and was preparing to squeeze through when a sharp voice froze him in place. What the hell do you think you're doing? Max stood 10 feet away, face flushed with anger, having apparently doubled back after leaving. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. James straightened, still holding the grate. It's my barn too. I have a right to see what's inside. Max advanced, eyes dark with rage. There's nothing in there but dangerous equipment and rotting wood. The floor could give way any minute. I'm just trying to keep you from getting yourself killed. James stood his ground. Then why the new locks? Why tear pages out of grandfather's journals? What are you hiding? Max, for a moment he thought Max might hit him. The older man's face contorted, a vein pulsing in his forehead. Then with visible effort he reined himself in. You want in the barn so bad, fine. But on my terms. He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket and strode to the main doors, unlocking them with sharp, angry movements. The doors swung open with a groan of protest. See for yourself, old tractors and hay. Nothing worth all this drama. James stepped inside, cautiously aware of Max watching his every move. The interior looked different from his brief glimpse the day before, more organized as if recently straightened. The hay bales he'd moved were back in perfect alignment. The space felt staged. He moved slowly around the perimeter, noting how Max tensed whenever he approached certain areas. There was definitely something hidden here, but he wouldn't find it with Max hovering over him. After making a show of examining the old equipment, James nodded. Guess you're right. Just needed to see for myself. Max's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained suspicious. Now you've seen it. Stay out unless I'm with you. That roof beam could come down any day. He gestured to a wooden support that did indeed look worryingly rotted. James retreated, knowing he'd need to be more strategic. That night he typed Dr. Sarah Running Bear into a search engine again this time, finding her university email address. He composed a careful message mentioning his grandfather and the keybound asking if they could speak about the project. He wasn't sure if she'd respond or even if she still used this address, but it was worth trying. The next morning, an email notification woke him before dawn. Dr. Running Bear had replied to her message, brief but urgent. Call me immediately. Do not discuss this with your uncle. The collection is at risk. She answered on the first ring, her voice low and intense. James Reed Raymond's grandson. Yes. I found your contact information in a letter he left for me. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you since the funeral, but the lawyers wouldn't release your information. Her voice was tense with urgency. Your grandfather and I worked together for years documenting and preserving artifacts found on your farm. The site is incredibly significant, one of the most comprehensive collections of Oneida cultural items ever discovered on private land. Raymond was meticulous about preservation and documentation. We were planning to establish a small museum. Museum James echoed, struggling to process this information. My grandfather was collecting Native American artifacts. Not just collecting, documenting an entire settlement that existed on that land for hundreds of years before European settlers arrived. The artifacts are historically priceless, but more importantly, they're culturally sacred to my people. She paused, her voice hardening. Your uncle has been selling pieces from the collection. I've tracked 3 items to private collectors already. Without proper provenance documentation, it's nearly impossible to recover them legally. James's mind raced. The coded list in Max's handwriting, the late-night barn visits, the mysterious canvas bags. It all made sense now. How many artifacts are we talking about? Over 400 documented pieces. Your grandfather built a climate-controlled underground chamber beneath the barn floor. That's where the collection is housed, or was. I need to see what remains. Can you meet me at the farm tomorrow? James explained about the new locks, the threatening note, Max's vigilance. She listened carefully, then said, I have copies of some of Raymond's documentation, including the legal agreement he made with the tribal council. That might help us gain legitimate access. In the meantime, don't confront your uncle. These artifacts are worth hundreds of thousands on the black market. People have been killed for less. After hanging up, James sat on the edge of his bed, mind reeling. His simple farmer grandfather had been operating a sophisticated archaeological preservation project right under the family's nose, and Max was systematically looting it. He needed proof before Dr. Running Bear arrived. Proof that wouldn't require breaking into the barn again. The farming journals. If his grandfather had been documenting his archaeological finds as carefully as Dr. Running Bear suggested, there must be records somewhere. James returned to the journals, this time reading with new understanding. What he'd taken for farming notes now revealed their true meaning. Northfield yielded 3 vessels after spring rain wasn't about crop containers. It was about pottery artifacts. Eastern boundary markers established with proper documentation referred to archaeological survey points, not property lines. The gaps in the journals still puzzled him until he realized they might not be gaps at all, but separate records kept elsewhere. Somewhere Max wouldn't think to look. James methodically searched his grandfather's bedroom, checking under floorboards, behind drawers, inside hollow bedposts. Nothing. The office yielded similar results. He was about to give up when he noticed something odd about his grandfather's favorite reading chair in the living room. The cushion seemed unusually firm on one side. Carefully slitting the seam with a pocket knife, James discovered a slim leather-bound volume tucked inside the cushion's stuffing. The first page bore a simple title, Collection Registry, Site RR01. The contents confirmed everything Dr. Running Bear had told him. Detailed sketches of artifacts, precise measurements, photographs carefully pasted onto pages, GPS coordinates and dates. Most entries included notes about the historical and cultural significance of each item. The level of care and respect evident in his grandfather's documentation was remarkable. The final pages contained something even more damning. A complete inventory list with photographs of each artifact numbered and categorized. James could use this to identify exactly what was missing. He was so engrossed in the registry that he didn't hear Max enter the house. The heavy hand on his shoulder made him jump, the book tumbling to the floor. What's that? Max's voice was dangerously quiet as he bent to pick up the registry. His face darkened as he flipped through the pages. Where did you find this? James stood, putting distance between them. Grandfather's chair. Seems he kept better records than you gave him credit for. Max slammed the book shut. You have no idea what you're meddling with, city boy. This is family business. Selling off Native American artifacts is federal crime business, James countered. Watching his uncle flinch at the accusation, I know what you've been doing, Max. I've talked to Dr. Running Bear. Max's face paled, then flushed with anger. That woman has no right to interfere. Your grandfather lost his mind in his final years, getting mixed up with her and her tribal claims. This is Reed land. Everything found on it belongs to us. It belongs in a museum, which is exactly what grandfather was creating. Dr. Running Bear is coming tomorrow with the documentation to prove it. Max stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You think anyone's going to believe some city kid who just showed up over me? I've been managing this farm for years. Everyone in town knows me. They'll think you're just trying to cash in on your inheritance. The registry in his hands spoke volumes, but James knew it wasn't enough. He needed to see the collection for himself document what remained before confronting Max with authorities present. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake, listening to Max moving around downstairs. The occasional murmur of phone conversations, the creak of the back door as his uncle made several trips to and from the barn. Around 2 a.m., the house finally fell silent. James crept to his window, watching as lights flickered in the barn before going dark. Max was preparing for something. The urgency in Dr. Running Bear's voice echoed in his mind. The collection is at risk. He couldn't wait until morning. Slipping downstairs with the flashlight from his phone guiding his way, James checked the back door. Locked with the key removed. Max was being cautious. Moving to the front door, he found it similarly secured. Then he remembered the cellar door, the old exterior entrance his grandfather had used to bring in preserved vegetables from the garden. Would Max have thought to secure that too? The cellar doors angled up from the ground on the north side of the house, partly hidden by overgrown shrubs. The padlock hanging there was old and rusted, likely untouched for years. James found a pry bar in the garden shed and with some effort managed to break the lock without making too much noise. The cellar was cool and smelled of earth and old potatoes. Using his phone's light, James navigated through the dusty space to the interior stairs that led up to the kitchen. The door at the top was unlocked. Max hadn't anticipated this route. Outside, the night was clear and cold stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. James moved silently across the yard toward the barn, staying in the shadows. No sign of Max. He must have returned to the house after his last trip. The main doors were locked as expected, but James now had a better plan. Instead of trying to break in, he positioned himself behind a stack of firewood with a clear view of the barn doors. If his suspicions were correct, Max would make his move before Dr. Running Bear arrived in the morning. The hours crawled by. James pulled his jacket tighter against the pre-dawn chill, fighting to stay awake. Just as the eastern sky began to lighten, his patience was rewarded. The farmhouse door opened and Max emerged carrying a duffel bag. He moved purposefully to his truck, stowed the bag, then returned to the house, emerging moments later with a larger suitcase. James watched heart pounding, and his uncle made 3 more trips loading the truck with what appeared to be hastily packed belongings. Max was planning to run. On the final trip, Max headed not to the house, but to the barn, unlocking the main doors and disappearing inside. This was the moment James had been waiting for. Moving quickly but quietly, he approached the barn, slipping through the partially open doors. Inside, the scene was illuminating. Several hay bales had been moved aside, revealing a section of the floor where the dirt had been disturbed. A wooden trap door stood open, warm light spilling up from below. James could hear Max moving around in the underground space, the sound of items being packed, glass or pottery clinking. James positioned himself behind a tractor phone camera, ready to document whatever he was about to witness. Minutes later, Max climbed up a wooden ladder, a carefully wrapped bundle in his arms. He placed it in a waiting crate, then descended again. This continued several more times, Max retrieving items from below, wrapping them in cloth, placing them in crates. On his 5th trip up the ladder, Max froze, eyes locked on James's hiding spot. "Who's there?" His hand moved to his waistband, and with shock, James saw the glint of a pistol. "It's me, Uncle." James stepped into view, hands raised slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "You're taking the last of them, aren't you? Clearing out before Dr. Running Bear arrives." Max's expression hardened, the gun still in his hand but pointed at the floor. You don't understand what's at stake here. The farm is drowning in debt. Your precious grandfather refused every offer of modernization that might have made this place profitable. He was living in a fantasy world with his artifacts and museums. So you decided to sell off his life's work, pieces of history that don't belong to you? Max laughed bitterly. Don't belong to me. I've worked this land for 30 years. While you were off getting fancy degrees, I was here watching the old man waste money on climate control for pottery fragments instead of fixing the tractor. He made his choice and I'm making mine. James took a cautious step forward. It's not too late to fix this, Uncle. The running bear said there might be a way to recover the pieces you've already sold. The museum project could actually save the farm. That's what Grandfather was working toward. For a moment, doubt flickered across Max's face. Then his expression hardened again. You think I didn't know about his plans? He showed me the proposal. A museum run by the tribe with me, relegated to giving hayride tours to school children. This is Reed land, and I'll be damned if I hand it over to become some cultural heritage site. The gun in his hand rose slightly. James's throat went dry. You can't just disappear with artifacts that have been documented. People know about the collection now. Max's smile was cold. By the time anyone figures out what's missing, I'll be long gone. As for you, his voice took on a threatening edge. You've got a choice to make. Walk away now, forget what you saw, and I'll leave you the farm. Otherwise, the implied threat hung in the air between them. James's mind raced. He needed to keep Max talking until he could figure a way out of this. How much have you already sold? Max seemed to relax slightly, perhaps taking James's question as interest rather than stalling. Enough to clear the mortgage. 3 pieces to a collector in Chicago. He pays well, no questions asked. These, he gestured to the crates, are the real prize. Ceremonial items, worth more than this whole farm 10 times over. And what happens to Grandfather's legacy? 30 years of work, just gone legacy. Max spat the word. What legacy? A collection nobody can see buried under a barn. He waved the gun toward the trapdoor. Go on, take a look. See what the old man valued more than making this farm work. James approached the opening, cautiously aware of Max behind him, the gun still in hand. A wooden ladder descended about 8 feet to what appeared to be a concrete floor. Warm light glowed from below. Keeping his movements slow and telegraphed, James began to descend the ladder. The space that opened before him took his breath away. A rectangular room about 12 by 20 feet with concrete walls and a surprisingly sophisticated lighting system. Display cases lined the walls, many now empty, but some still containing artifacts, pottery arrowheads, jewelry tools, all carefully labeled and preserved. Maps covered one wall, topographical surveys of the farm with various locations marked in red ink. A desk sat in one corner covered with ledgers and documents. It was a museum-quality installation hidden beneath the barn floor all these years. Many of the display cases stood open and empty, their contents already removed. James ran his fingers along the labels, reading his grandfather's neat handwriting, describing each item's significance and the precise location where it had been found. Behind him, Max descended the ladder gun, still in hand, but his attention divided between James and the remaining artifacts. When my father first found that pottery fragment while plowing the north field, I thought he'd lost his mind. Spent a whole day on his hands and knees instead of finishing the planting. Then he found another and another. He laughed bitterly, became obsessed. Every season, more digging, more cataloging. Money that should have gone into equipment went to these. He gestured contemptuously at the display cases. These are historically priceless, James said quietly, examining a delicately carved bone tool in one of the remaining cases. This is a record of people who lived here for hundreds of years before our family ever arrived, Max snorted. Priceless to who? Museums that would have paid him nothing. That tribe that wanted to take control of our land? He shook his head. I found a buyer who understands their real value. The sound of tires on gravel drifted down from above. Max's head snapped up, eyes widening. You expecting someone? Before James could answer, a woman's voice called out. James, are you here, Dr. Running Bear? She'd arrived early. Max's expression darkened. He raised the gun, pointing it squarely at James now. Not a sound you understand. We're going to go up there and you're going to tell her to leave. Say you made a mistake. If you say anything else, his meaning was clear. Heart-pounding, James nodded. Max gestured for him to climb the ladder first, following close behind. At the top, James emerged into the barn to find her Sarah Running Bear standing just inside the door. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying black hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her gaze moved from James to Max, then to the open trapdoor, and finally to the gun in Max's hand. "I see I'm not interrupting anything important," she said calmly, though her eyes betrayed her concern. "Just a nephew and uncle discussing family history at gunpoint." Max's face flushed with anger. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Dr. Running Bear reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "Actually, I have documentation signed by Raymond Reed granting me access to the collection at any time." She opened the folder, revealing papers covered with official stamps and signatures, including a court order preventing the removal of any artifacts from the premises pending a full inventory. Max's grip on the gun tightened. "Court orders don't mean much out here." "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but the federal agents waiting in my car might." She held up her phone. "One call and they'll be here in seconds. They're quite interested in the three Oneida ceremonial vessels that recently appeared on the black market." James could see the calculations running behind his uncle's eyes, weighing his options, looking for a way out. Slowly, Max lowered the gun. "It was just business," he said finally. "The farm was drowning in debt. Dad refused to see reason." Dr. Running Bear's expression remained impassive. "So you decided to steal and sell culturally significant artifacts instead of honoring your father's wishes?" She shook her head. The irony is Raymond had already secured funding for the museum project. The tribe was prepared to invest considerably in preserving both the collection and the agricultural heritage of this land. Max's face registered shock. "What are you talking about?" She turned to James. "Your grandfather finalized an agreement with the tribal council 3 months before his death. The plan was to convert the barn into the Reed Family Agricultural and Cultural Heritage Museum, showcasing both the artifacts and the farming history of this land. The tribe would provide funding for renovation and ongoing maintenance in exchange for proper preservation and display of the collection." She smiled sadly. "He was so excited to tell you both." The letter went out the week before his heart attack. James remembered the torn pages from the journal, the missing correspondence. Had Max destroyed his grandfather's attempts to share this plan? Max seemed to deflate before their eyes, the gun dangling forgotten in his hand. "Why didn't he tell me himself?" he tried. Running Bear said gently, "According to his journal, he approached you several times, but you dismissed his museum nonsense without letting him explain. Eventually, he decided to wait until the legal paperwork was finalized before trying again." James looked at his uncle, seeing not the threatening figure of moments ago, but a desperate man who had missed a chance at redemption. "There's still a way forward, Uncle. We can contact the buyers, try to recover what's been sold. The museum can still happen." Max's laugh was hollow. "You think anyone's going to let me be part of this now?" "After what I've done, that depends," the Running Bear said, her voice firm, but not unkind, "on whether you're willing to make amends. The first step would be returning everything you haven't yet sold and providing information about the buyers who have the rest." For a long moment, the barn was silent, save for the wind rattling the loose shingles overhead. Then, with a defeated sigh, Max placed the gun on a nearby hay bale and nodded. "I've got names and contact information in the house, and receipts for what I've sold. Most of the collection is still here. I was planning to move the valuable pieces today." Dr. Running Bear nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I'll need to call in my team to document what remains and begin recovery efforts for the missing pieces." She turned to James. "Your grandfather believed in you, said you had the perfect combination of respect for tradition and forward-thinking creativity. That's why he left the farm to you. He wanted someone who would honor the past while building toward the future." James looked around the barn, seeing it not as it was, dilapidated and neglected, but as it could be, a place where history was preserved and shared, where the story of this land and all who had lived on it would be told for generations to come. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the farmyard. A new day was beginning at the Reed farm, and with it the chance to uncover truths long buried beneath its soil. James Reed hadn't known what he would find when he returned to his grandfather's farm after 15 years away. Certainly not an underground archaeological treasure, a museum in the making, or a desperate uncle willing to destroy a legacy for a quick profit. But standing in that barn with a trapdoor open to secrets below, and Dr. Running Bear already making calls to bring in preservation specialists, he felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his job in Boston: purpose. What lies beneath supports what stands above. His grandfather's cryptic words now made perfect sense. The history buried in this soil had supported the Reed family for generations, even when they didn't know it was there. Now it was James's turn to support that history, to protect it, and to share it with the world. The morning after the confrontation in the barn, the Reed farm transformed into a hive of activity. Dr. Sarah Running Bear arrived with a team of 3 specialists from the Oneida Cultural Preservation Office, their SUVs loaded with equipment for documenting and preserving artifacts. They moved with practiced efficiency, setting up workstations in the underground chamber, while James watched in fascination. One of their first actions was to change the locks on the barn doors, replacing Max's padlocks with new ones. 2 sets of keys were made, one for James and one for Dr. Running Bear. Max stood off to the side, arms crossed, his face a mask of resignation, as his control over the barn and its secrets slipped away. "Your grandfather was truly remarkable," Dr. Running Bear told James as they descended the ladder into the underground chamber. "Most people who find artifacts on their property either ignore them or sell them immediately. Raymond taught himself proper archaeological documentation methods. He consulted experts. He built this climate-controlled space at considerable personal expense. The preservation team had laid out large photographic sheets on the desk, comparing the current state of the collection with the inventory records. The gaps were immediately apparent. Nearly 30% of the artifacts were missing. Max admitted to selling 12 pieces so far, providing names and contact information for 3 buyers. The most significant sales had gone to a private collector in Chicago named Edward Whitaker, who had purchased 3 ceremonial vessels for substantial sums. The Running Bear's expression darkened as she examined the documentation. These particular items aren't just valuable artifacts. They're sacred objects that should never have been removed from tribal custody in the first place. She ran her finger along a photograph of one of the missing vessels, a beautifully decorated clay pot with symbols etched around its circumference. This dates back approximately 700 years. It was likely used in coming-of-age ceremonies. James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "What can we do to get them back?" Dr. Running Bear closed the folder with a determined snap. "I've already contacted the FBI's art crime team. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act gives us legal standing to recover culturally significant items. But these cases can be complicated, especially when buyers claim they purchased in good faith." That evening, while the preservation team continued their inventory, James sat at his grandfather's computer researching Dr. Sarah Running Bear. The results painted a picture of a formidable woman, PhD in anthropology from Cornell, 20 years as curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, before returning to work directly with the Oneida Nation, author of numerous papers on cultural preservation and repatriation of indigenous artifacts. His grandfather had partnered with a genuine expert. James also found several academic articles co-authored by R. Reed and S. Running Bear about ethical preservation methods on private properties and community-based archaeological stewardship. The publications dated back nearly 8 years, suggesting a long-standing professional relationship. Most interesting was a proposal they'd submitted to the Tribal Heritage Grant Program, outlining plans for the Reed Farm Agricultural and Cultural Heritage Museum. The document described a dual-purpose educational facility that would preserve and display both the Native American artifacts found on the property and the farming history of the Reed family. Architectural renderings showed the barn transformed into a modern museum space while maintaining its historical character, with the underground chamber serving as a special exhibition area for the most significant artifacts. The grant had been approved 3 months before his grandfather's death, with initial funding of $375,000 allocated for renovation and educational programming. Everything had been in place for the project to begin. Then Raymond Reed had his fatal heart attack, and Max had seen an opportunity. Digging deeper, James found a trove of emails between his grandfather and Dr. Running Bear discussing the project in detail, their vision, concerns, and hopes. The tone was professional but warm, revealing a deep mutual respect. In one message his grandfather had written, Sarah, I want James to be part of this when the time is right. He has an artist's eye and a designer's mind. This place needs someone who can see both its past and its future. James felt a lump form in his throat. His grandfather had believed in him, had seen potential he himself hadn't recognized. Now sitting in the darkened office, surrounded by evidence of Raymond Reed's unexpected passion for preservation, James felt a connection to his grandfather, stronger than any he'd known while the man was alive. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Running Bear stood in the doorway, exhaustion evident in the lines of her face. We've completed the initial documentation. There's something you should see. She led him back to the barn, now illuminated by professional-grade lighting the team had installed. The underground chamber looked different, more organized with artifacts carefully arranged on acid-free padding. One of the specialists, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses, carefully lifted what appeared to be an ordinary stone from a newly opened crate. This is what your grandfather called the Founder's Stone. According to his notes, it was the first artifact he ever found nearly 30 years ago. She pointed to faint markings on its surface. These symbols align with 18th century Oneida craftwork, not particularly valuable on the market, but historically significant. He kept it as a reminder of where everything began. James accepted the stone, turning it over in his hands. The weight of 3 decades of his grandfather's work, starting from this single discovery, felt momentous. Dr. Running Bear pulled out a tablet, bringing up a map of the farm with dozens of colored pins marking locations across the property. Each pin represents a documented find site. Your grandfather mapped everything meticulously, creating one of the most comprehensive archaeological surveys of private land in the state. She zoomed in on a cluster of pins near the creek. This area shows evidence of continuous habitation spanning nearly 800 years. The realization hit James with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about artifacts. This was about recognizing that the land his family had farmed for generations had been home to people for centuries before the first European settlers arrived. His grandfather had understood this connection and had dedicated the latter part of his life to honoring it. The next morning, James woke early and found Max sitting on the porch steps staring out at the fields. For the first time since James's arrival, his uncle looked his age. Tired lines etching his face, shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. "I messed up, kid." Max's voice was rough with emotion. "Dad tried to tell me about the museum plan. Came to me with all these papers and projections. I thought it was just another one of his crazy projects, like the time he wanted to convert the South Field to organic lavender." I didn't even let him finish explaining. James settled beside him on the steps, the morning dew soaking through his jeans. "Why did you start selling the artifacts?" Max's laugh held no humor. "After the funeral, I found all the documentation about the collection. Got curious about what it might be worth. Called a dealer in Chicago who'd left his card with Dad years ago. One thing led to another. The farm was underwater on the mortgage. I convinced myself I was just doing what was necessary to save the family legacy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. In trying to save one legacy, Max had nearly destroyed another. "An FBI agent is coming today," James said quietly. "Doctor Running Bear says if you cooperate fully, provide all the buyer information, help recover the sold pieces, they might consider reduced charges." Max nodded resignation in every line of his body. "I'll tell them everything I know. Most of the pieces are still here anyway. I only sold 12 out of more than 400. His eyes lifted to meet James's. "What will you do with the place?" James looked out over the morning-misted fields, the weathered barn, the farmhouse in need of paint and care. For the first time since arriving, he could see possibilities instead of burdens. "I think I'll honor Grandfather's plan. Build the museum. Maybe find a way to keep the farm operational too." Later that morning, Dr. Running Bear arrived with Special Agent Marcus Calloway from the FBI's art crime team. Tall and precise in his movements with close-cropped hair and observant eyes, Calloway projected an air of methodical determination as he interviewed Max about the stolen artifacts. In the kitchen, James and Dr. Running Bear spread out the museum plans on the table, discussing next steps. "The grant money is still available," she explained, tracing the architectural rendering with her finger. "We'll need to submit updated proposals, of course, but the tribal council remains committed to the project." Her expression grew serious. "The question is, are you?" "This will be a years-long commitment." James thought about his life in Boston, the failed job, the cramped apartment, the sense of drifting without purpose. Then he looked at the plans before him, envisioning the transformed barn visitors learning about the dual history of this land, his grandfather's work continuing. I'm in. I have design experience that could help with the educational displays and promotional materials. Dr. Running Bear's smile showed genuine relief. Raymond always said you were the right person for this. He'd be proud. The interview with Max concluded with him signing several documents and surrendering his passport. Agent Calloway informed him that while formal charges were pending, his cooperation would be noted favorably. Over the next few days, the preservation team continued their work documenting each artifact in the collection and creating a comprehensive digital database. James assisted where he could, learning about proper handling techniques and storage protocols. Dr. Running Bear introduced him to the team members: Lisa Kingbird, the artifacts specialist; Tom White, the digital documentation expert; and Marcus Hill, an archaeologist specializing in northeastern indigenous settlements. They worked with practiced coordination, each bringing specialized knowledge to the project. Each evening, James immersed himself in his grandfather's detailed records, gaining a deeper understanding of the collection's significance. The artifacts told stories of daily life, spiritual practices, technological innovation, and artistic expression, spanning nearly a millennium. His grandfather had recognized the importance of preserving these stories, not just the objects themselves. One evening, as James was reviewing site documentation, he noticed something odd. His grandfather's meticulous records mentioned a secondary storage location for overflow items and recent acquisitions. Yet the team had found no evidence of this second location. When he brought this to Dr. Running Bear's attention the next morning, her brow furrowed in concentration. Did your grandfather have any other secure storage areas on the property? A cellar, perhaps, or a hidden room in the house? They searched the farmhouse thoroughly, checking for false walls or concealed spaces, but found nothing. The cellar contained only old preserves and forgotten farm equipment. If there was a second storage location, Raymond Reed had hidden it well. The mystery deepened when Lisa discovered a notation in the inventory records. Items A37 through A52 transferred to secondary site following water concerns. October 2021. 16 artifacts had been moved somewhere, but where? On the fourth day of the investigation, Agent Calloway returned with troubling news. Edward Whitaker, the Chicago collector who had purchased the most valuable pieces, was claiming he'd acquired them legally through a reputable dealer. He had documentation, which had to be forged, suggesting the artifacts had been in private hands for decades. Dr. Running Bear's expression hardened as she examined the paperwork Calloway presented. These certificates are skillfully done, but completely fraudulent. The vessels were documented in situ by Raymond Reed in 2017. They've never been in any private collection before Max removed them. The problem, Calloway explained, was that Whitaker was politically connected and wealthy enough to fight a protracted legal battle. Without irrefutable evidence linking these specific artifacts to the Reed farm recovery could be challenging. What kind of evidence would be sufficient? James asked. Photographic documentation of the actual excavation would be ideal, Calloway replied, or unique identifying characteristics that match your grandfather's detailed records. James remembered something. His grandfather had mentioned in one journal entry that he had recorded video of significant finds. If those videos existed, they might provide the evidence needed to recover the stolen pieces. The search for both the missing videos and the secondary storage location consumed the next 2 days. James combed through every digital device in the house, finding hundreds of photographs but no videos. He checked external hard drives, old computers in the attic, even a collection of thumb drives in his grandfather's desk drawer. Nothing. Meanwhile, the preservation team methodically explored the property using ground-penetrating radar to search for any other underground structures. They found plenty of archaeological evidence of the historic settlement, but no secret storage bunker. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While helping Lisa reorganize a shelf of artifacts, James knocked over a small wooden box containing cataloging supplies. As he picked it up, he noticed it was unexpectedly heavy, and something inside shifted. Closer examination revealed a false bottom, and inside a single key with a small tag reading only RC. RC. The initials triggered a memory. His grandfather occasionally mentioning checking on things at the RC when heading out in his truck. James had always assumed it was a person's initials or a local business. What if it was a place? He brought the key to Dr. Running Bear, who examined it thoughtfully. Any idea what RC might stand for? James ran through possibilities in his mind. Reed something. Reed Corner. Reed Creek. His eyes widened with sudden realization. The root cellar. Not the main cellar under the house, but the old storage cellar by the north field where his grandfather had kept root vegetables for winter in the days before modern refrigeration. James hadn't even thought to check it, assuming it had fallen into disuse years ago. 20 minutes later, James, Dr. Running Bear, and Agent Calloway stood before what appeared to be an abandoned root cellar built into a small hillside at the property's northern edge. Overgrown with vines and partially concealed by a stand of young maples, it was easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. The padlock was newer than the weathered wooden doors it secured. James inserted the key, feeling a moment of resistance before the lock clicked open. The hinges protested as they pulled the doors wide, revealing concrete steps descending into darkness. The beam of Calloway's flashlight illuminated a surprisingly modern space, approximately 15 by 15 feet, with concrete walls, metal shelving, and a small but efficient dehumidifier humming in one corner. Battery-powered emergency lights cast a soft glow over the room. Unlike the main collection beneath the barn, which was organized for display and study, this space was clearly designed for secure storage. Metal cabinets lined one wall, each labeled with catalog numbers. A small workstation stood in the corner with a laptop computer, external hard drive, and photography equipment. Dr. Running Bear moved immediately to the cabinets, opening the first one to reveal foam-lined drawers containing carefully wrapped artifacts. These are recent finds, she noted, examining the tags. All documented within the last 3 years. She moved to the next cabinet, and these appear to be the items mentioned in the transfer notes, moved here due to water concerns in the main chamber. But it was the discovery in the third cabinet that made Agent Calloway let out a low whistle of appreciation. Inside, neatly arranged on special stands, were exact plaster replicas of the stolen ceremonial vessels, along with comprehensive documentation folders for each one. Beside them sat an external hard drive labeled Video Documentation, Excavation and Authentication. Your grandfather was thorough, Calloway said with genuine admiration. He didn't just document his finds, he created an entire authentication package for each significant artifact. James connected the hard drive to the laptop, finding dozens of video files organized by artifact number. He clicked on one labeled CV03 Excavation, the code for one of the stolen ceremonial vessels. The screen filled with footage of his grandfather carefully excavating a partially buried clay pot. Raymond Reed's voice provided running commentary on the location, soil conditions, and surrounding context. The video continued through the cleaning process, detailed examination, and careful measurement of the vessel, capturing its unique markings and distinctive crack pattern that had been repaired using traditional methods. This is exactly what we need, Calloway said, already pulling out his phone. Clear chain of custody, documented excavation, distinctive identifying features. Whitaker won't be able to maintain his claim that these came from another source. While Calloway made calls, Dr. Running Bear examined the remaining contents of the root cellar, discovering something that made her breath catch. In a specially constructed case sat what appeared to be an ordinary stone tool, except it wasn't ordinary at all. James, she called softly. Do you know what your grandfather had here? He joined her at the case, looking at the unremarkable gray stone implement inside. This is a ceremonial cutting tool that matches descriptions in our oral histories. Running Bear explained, her voice filled with reverence. It was believed lost during the forced relocations of the 1800s. Her fingers hovered just above the case. Your grandfather must have recognized its significance, but kept it separate from the main collection for additional security. James felt a sudden, profound connection to the generations who had lived on this land before his family, who had crafted and used this tool in ceremonies long before European settlement. His grandfather had understood this connection too, had dedicated years to preserving these threads between past and present. Over the next 2 days, the contents of the root cellar were carefully inventoried and added to the main database. The video evidence proved invaluable. Agent Calloway reported that, faced with irrefutable documentation, Edward Whitaker had agreed to return the ceremonial vessels rather than face prosecution for trafficking in stolen cultural artifacts. The other buyers Max had dealt with were proving more cooperative as well, with 9 of the 12 stolen pieces already recovered or in process of being returned. Max himself remained subdued, helping where he could and providing additional details about his transactions when asked. A week after the discovery of the root cellar, the running bear called a meeting in the farmhouse kitchen. The tribal council representatives would be arriving the following day to discuss moving forward with the museum project, and there were decisions to be made. The grant provides funding for renovating the barn and creating the exhibition space, she explained, spreading architectural plans across the table. But it doesn't cover continued farming operations. We need to determine if maintaining agricultural production is part of the vision going forward. James had been thinking about this question extensively. The farm had been in the Reed family for generations, and abandoning that legacy felt wrong. Yet the financial realities were challenging. Modern farming required significant investment in equipment and expertise he didn't possess. What if we integrated the agricultural component into the educational mission he suggested? Not trying to run a commercial farm, but maintaining demonstration fields showcasing traditional farming methods, both indigenous techniques and early European approaches. We could involve local schools, maybe start a community garden program. Running Bear nodded thoughtfully. That aligns well with the educational mission. The tribal council might be willing to extend the funding to include such initiatives. From his place at the end of the table, Max cleared his throat. I could help with that part. The farming, I mean. His words came hesitantly, a man unused to offering rather than demanding. I know this land, know the growing cycles, what works and what doesn't. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of past actions and uncertain futures. Max had nearly destroyed the collection out of greed and desperation. Could he be trusted to be part of its preservation? James studied his uncle's face, seeing not the threatening figure from their confrontation in the barn, but a man seeking redemption. The land needs someone who understands it, he said finally. If you're willing to work within the project's goals, your experience would be valuable. The tension in Max's shoulders eased slightly, though wariness remained in his eyes. It'll take more than words to make things right. I know that. The next morning, a delegation from the Oneida Tribal Council arrived. 3 members accompanied by their legal counsel and cultural affairs director. They toured the collection, examined the documentation, and discussed the proposed museum plans with professional interest but reserved judgment. James observed their interactions with Dr. Running Bear, noting the respect with which they treated her and each other. This wasn't just a business transaction or simple grant allocation. This was a negotiation about cultural heritage and shared stewardship of history. The most senior council member, Walter Schuyler, a dignified man in his 70s with silver hair and penetrating dark eyes, addressed James directly after the tour. Your grandfather did something remarkable here. Not just preserving these items, but documenting them properly, keeping them in context. Many collectors take artifacts as curiosities, stripping them of their meaning. Raymond Reed understood these objects tell stories that belong to all of us. Later in the formal meeting held in the farmhouse dining room, the legal complexities were addressed. The collection would remain physically at the Reed farm, but with official recognition of the Oneida Nation's cultural ownership of the indigenous artifacts. The museum would be jointly operated with tribal representatives having final authority on how sacred items were displayed and interpreted. The funding would be expanded to include James's proposed agricultural education program, with additional grants possibly available through the USDA's Rural Development Initiative. Construction could begin as soon as the necessary permits were approved, with a target opening date the following summer. As the meeting concluded, Walter Schuyler fixed Max with a steady gaze. We understand you have been cooperating with authorities to recover the stolen items. The council acknowledges this positive step. His expression remained solemn. Actions have consequences that can't be undone, but moving forward in a good way matters. Max nodded, accepting both the acknowledgement and the implicit reminder of his responsibility. After the delegation departed, James spent the evening walking the property, trying to see it through new eyes. Not just as the farm he'd visited as a child, but as a place of layered histories and interconnected stories. The fields where his grandfather had planted the corn were the same fields where Oneida farmers had grown the Three Sisters crops of corn, beans, and squash centuries earlier. The creek that marked the eastern property line had provided water to countless generations. Standing beside that creek in the gathering dusk, James felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced in his urban life. His grandfather had recognized something profound about this land and had dedicated his final years to honoring it. Now that responsibility had passed to him. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Architectural consultants visited to assess the barn's structural needs for conversion to a museum space. Grant paperwork was completed and submitted. Running Bear worked with her team to develop a comprehensive exhibition plan that would tell the intertwined stories of the land's indigenous history and agricultural development. James found himself drawing on his design background, creating concept sketches for the exhibition spaces, and developing ideas for interactive displays that would engage visitors of all ages. His training, which had seemed wasted in a series of unfulfilling jobs in Boston, suddenly found perfect application. Max, operating in a state of perpetual caution, focused on documenting the farm's agricultural history, gathering old photographs, equipment catalogs, and records of crop yields stretching back to his great-grandfather's time. It was his way of contributing to the project while respecting the boundaries established around the artifact collection. 2 weeks after the discovery of the root cellar, Agent Calloway returned with the best possible news. All 3 ceremonial vessels had been recovered from Edward Whitaker's collection. Though Whitaker continued to maintain he had purchased them in good faith, the video evidence had made his position legally untenable. Rather than face charges, he had agreed to return the items and provide information about the dealer who had sold them to him. The vessels arrived in specialized transport containers, accompanied by a curator from the Chicago Field Museum who had assisted in their safe removal from Whitaker's private gallery. When the first container was carefully opened in the underground chamber, Dr. Running Bear's usual professional composure wavered for a moment. Her fingers trembled slightly as she examined the ancient vessel, confirming it was indeed the one documented in Raymond Reed's videos. "This is a tremendous outcome," she said, regaining her composure. "Recovery of stolen cultural items is rarely this complete or this quick." The second piece of good news came from the district attorney's office. In light of Max's complete cooperation and the successful recovery of nearly all stolen items, they were recommending reduced charges, misdemeanor theft rather than felony trafficking in cultural artifacts. He would likely face probation and community service rather than imprisonment. When James shared this information with his uncle, Max's response was subdued. "Doesn't erase what I did, but it's more than I deserve." His weathered hands worked restlessly at the kitchen table. "I keep thinking about what Dad would say if he could see all this. Part of me thinks he'd be disappointed. Another part thinks maybe he'd understand making mistakes." James considered his grandfather, the man who had meticulously documented hundreds of artifacts, who had recognized the importance of preserving history rather than profiting from it, who had forged a partnership based on mutual respect with the descendants of those who had first lived on this land. "I think he'd say it's never too late to start making better choices," James replied finally. "That's what this whole project is about, acknowledging the past honestly while building something better for the future." The recovery of the ceremonial vessels marked a turning point in the project. With the most valuable items secured and legal issues moving toward resolution, attention shifted fully to the museum development. Architectural plans were finalized, contractor bids solicited, and exhibition design concepts refined. James found himself thriving in this new role, applying his creative skills to a project with genuine purpose. The urban design career that had left him unfulfilled now seemed like necessary preparation for what he was meant to do all along. Running Bear proved an invaluable mentor, guiding him through the complexities of museum development and cultural interpretation. Her decades of experience and deep respect for both the artifacts and the communities they represented shaped every aspect of the planning process. "We're not just creating displays of objects," she explained as they worked on the exhibition narrative. "We're creating a space where multiple perspectives and histories can be acknowledged. Indigenous voices must be centered in telling Indigenous stories. The Reed family history matters too, showing how these different threads intertwine on this land." The practical aspects of the project presented their own challenges. The barn's structural issues were more extensive than initially estimated, requiring significant reinforcement before museum conversion could begin. The underground chamber needed improved climate control and security systems to meet museum standards. Then there was the question of the farm itself. While the educational agriculture program had secured funding, the remaining fields presented a dilemma. Leaving them fallow seemed wasteful, yet maintaining full-scale farming operations wasn't feasible alongside the museum development. It was Max who proposed a solution. "What if we leased the back 40 to the Peterson family? Their farm borders ours on the west. They've been looking to expand for years. We keep the fields around the house and barn for the educational program, but the rest stays in production. Their lease payments could help support the museum operations. The idea had merit. The Petersons were respected local farmers with a commitment to sustainable practices. The arrangement would keep the land in agricultural use while providing additional income for the museum project. With each decision, each step forward, James felt more connected to the legacy his grandfather had left him. Not just the physical property, but a vision of stewardship that encompassed both cultural preservation and agricultural tradition. 3 weeks after the recovery of the ceremonial vessels, as contractors began preliminary work on the barn renovation, James received an unexpected phone call. The man on the other end introduced himself as Thomas Whitaker, Edward Whitaker's son. "My father asked me to contact you," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "He's reconsidering his position on some of the other items in his collection that may have questionable provenance." His tone suggested diplomatic phrasing of a difficult situation. "He wonders if you might be interested in examining certain pieces that could potentially have originated from your property." James listened with growing astonishment as Thomas explained that his father, facing scrutiny of his collection following the recovery of the Reed artifacts, had decided to reassess several other pieces acquired through the same dealer. The implication was clear. Edward Whitaker was attempting to mitigate potential legal exposure by voluntarily returning items he now suspected were illegally obtained. After consulting with Dr. Running Bear and Agent Calloway, James agreed to travel to Chicago the following week. The trip would serve multiple purposes: examining the questionable items in Whitaker's collection, meeting with museum specialists at the Field Museum who had offered consulting services for the Reed Farm project, and connecting with potential donors interested in supporting indigenous cultural preservation initiatives. As the date for the Chicago trip approached, activity at the farm intensified. The exhibition design team completed preliminary layouts. Contractors began stabilizing the barn's structural supports, and the Tribal Council's education coordinator visited to discuss programming for local schools. Through it all, James found himself growing more comfortable with his role as the project's leader. The directionless young man who had arrived at the farm with an eviction notice and termination papers in his pocket was being replaced by someone with purpose, vision, and a deepening appreciation for the responsibility he'd inherited. The evening before his departure for Chicago, James sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of amber and gold. The fields his family had farmed for generations stretched before him. The newly reinforced barn stood solid against the twilight, and somewhere beneath his feet lay traces of those who had called this land home for centuries before the Reed family arrived. His grandfather had recognized the profound connection between these seemingly separate stories and had dedicated his final years to preserving both. Now it was James's turn to continue that work, to help others see what Raymond Reed had understood: that the deepest truths often lie beneath the surface, waiting for someone to uncover them with patience, respect, and care. James returned from Chicago with mixed emotions, the 7 artifacts from Whitaker's collection weighing on his mind. The weather-beaten farm greeted him with a crisp autumn breeze, leaves beginning to turn amber and gold across the property. Contractors swarmed the barn's scaffolding, erected against its weathered sides, as the transformation from agricultural buildings to cultural institution gathered momentum. Dr. Running Bear met him at the farmhouse, her expression reflecting both curiosity and concern about his findings. When James laid out the photographs of the recovered artifacts on the kitchen table, her trained eyes immediately spotted patterns he had missed. These pieces all come from the northern section of the property. She traced a finger across the site map, indicating a cluster of discovery locations near the property boundary, not randomly selected items. They're all from a specific area, all discovered within a similar time frame. The geographical clustering puzzled them until Max, overhearing their conversation, provided unexpected insight. That section borders the Henderson property. Old Jim Henderson used to patrol that boundary line religiously, claiming Dad's fence encroached on his land by a few feet. He was always watching what happened on our side. The name Henderson struck a chord. James recalled meeting Bill Henderson at the hardware store weeks earlier, the owner who had mentioned supplying his grandfather with specialized preservation materials. The connection seemed promising enough to investigate further. The following morning, James visited the diner to speak with Mrs. Garcia. Her silver-streaked hair was tied in the same familiar bun hands, busy wiping down counters as she shared what she knew about the Henderson brothers. Jim and Raymond had the strangest relationship, 40 years of property disputes, then suddenly they're having coffee together in that corner booth every Thursday morning. She leaned in conspiratorially. Jim passed away about 3 years ago, but there was always something odd about that friendship, like they shared a secret nobody else was allowed to know. When James asked about Jim's interest in artifacts, Mrs. Garcia's eyebrows rose. Everyone in the county knew Jim Henderson collected Native American pieces, had a reputation for it since he was a boy. Some folks said he'd walk the freshly plowed fields after spring rains looking for what might have surfaced. The hardware store was bustling when James arrived, but Bill Henderson immediately ushered him into the cluttered office at the back upon hearing he wanted to discuss Jim's relationship with Raymond Reed. The storekeeper's normally gregarious demeanor turned guarded fingers drumming nervously on his desk. My brother was obsessed with those artifacts. When your grandfather found that first significant cache right along our property line, Jim was convinced half those pieces belonged to him. He claimed they came from what was rightfully Henderson land. Bill's expression softened slightly. The strange thing was, after decades of arguments, they suddenly became collaborators. Jim started helping your grandfather catalog the collection. He had a good eye for detail. The pieces began falling into place. James pressed gently, asking if Jim had ever mentioned selling artifacts. Bill's laugh held no humor. Jim was private about his finances. But after he died, I found more cash in his safety deposit box than his failing farm could have generated in a decade. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Back at the farm, Agent Calloway arranged for Gregory Walsh, the dealer who had purchased artifacts from Max, to be shown photographs of both Raymond Reed and Jim Henderson. Walsh identified Henderson without hesitation as his source for several Reed artifacts. According to Walsh, Henderson had presented himself as a legitimate broker with authorization to sell selected items from a private collection, providing convincingly forged documentation. The revelation sent ripples through the museum project. Raymond Reed's reputation remained untarnished. He had indeed been the careful steward that a running bear believed him to be. But the breach of trust by someone his grandfather had welcomed as a collaborator cast a shadow over the project and complicated the recovery process. With Walsh's cooperation, Agent Calloway began the painstaking process of tracing approximately 20 artifacts Jim Henderson had sold over 3 years to private collectors across the Midwest. Meanwhile, James and Dr. Running Bear conducted a comprehensive audit of the collection against the original inventory. The most significant breakthrough came 3 weeks later. An anonymous tip led investigators to Jim Henderson's storm cellar, where they discovered dozens of artifacts collected over decades from both Henderson and Reed properties. Many items had never been documented by Raymond Reed and represented an unexpected expansion of the collection's scope. This discovery necessitated complex negotiations with Bill Henderson, who initially claimed ownership of all items as part of his brother's estate. The legal questions were thorny. Who owned artifacts found on the boundary between properties? How could anyone definitively prove which side of the property line an item originated from, decades after its discovery? After consultation with cultural heritage, attorneys, and tribal representatives, a compromise emerged. Items that could be definitively sourced to the Reed property would join the museum collection. Artifacts from Henderson land would be properly documented before being divided between the museum and the local historical society, and sacred items would be repatriated to the tribe regardless of where they were found. The museum's narrative framework evolved to incorporate this complicated story of discovery, theft, and recovery. Rather than hiding these difficult chapters, Dr. Running Bear suggested using them to educate visitors about the ongoing challenges of cultural preservation. These objects have their own journeys, she explained, examining a delicately carved bone tool recently returned from a collector in Michigan. The theft and recovery become part of their story, demonstrating why protection matters and how communities unite to preserve cultural heritage. Our transparency about these challenges strengthens the museum's credibility. As autumn deepened, the barn's transformation accelerated. Structural engineers reinforced the historic timbers while preserving their character. Climate control systems were installed in the underground chamber to meet museum conservation standards. Exhibition designers worked with tribal representatives to create displays that would honor both scientific and indigenous knowledge systems. The project was not without setbacks. During installation of the electrical system, workers discovered extensive water damage in the barn's western wall, requiring unexpected repairs that strained the budget. Heavy rains delayed exterior renovations for nearly 2 weeks. Supply chain issues meant specialized display cases arrived a month behind schedule. Each problem required creative solutions and community support. When the budget shortfall threatened to delay completion, a fundraising dinner organized by Mrs. Garcia at the diner raised enough from local businesses to bridge the gap. When specialized archival materials were back-ordered, a museum in the state capital loaned temporary replacements. When additional labor was needed to meet deadlines, neighboring farmers volunteered their time. Throughout these challenges, James discovered strengths he hadn't known he possessed: negotiating with contractors, coordinating volunteers, making critical design decisions under pressure. The graphic designer who had felt adrift in Boston's corporate world found purpose in bringing his grandfather's vision to life. The relationship between James and Max evolved as well, though not without continued tension. Max fulfilled his community service hours methodically, initially performing basic maintenance tasks with minimal engagement. His knowledge of the property and farming techniques made him valuable to the educational components of the museum, but trust rebuilt slowly. One afternoon, James discovered Max painstakingly repairing an antique hand plow for the agricultural exhibit. The care with which his uncle worked, fingers tracing the worn wooden handles, gently removing decades of rust, revealed a connection to the land's history that transcended their personal conflicts. "Dad taught me to use a plow like this when I was 7. Max's voice was rough with unexpected emotion. "Said every farmer should know how to work the land without machinery just in case. I thought it was pointless back then. Now I'm probably one of the last people around here who remembers how." This knowledge, practical, embodied, passed through generations, was as much a part of the farm's heritage as the artifacts beneath it. James realized the museum needed to preserve these agricultural traditions alongside the archaeological collection. He expanded the educational programming to include demonstrations of traditional farming techniques, with Max reluctantly agreeing to serve as the primary instructor. By mid-autumn, the museum project faced its first major public test. The tribal council had arranged for a delegation of Oneida elders to visit the site and review the proposed exhibition content. Their approval would be essential for the museum's cultural legitimacy and continuing partnership. The delegation arrived on a crisp morning, 5 elders accompanied by younger family members who would assist in translating concepts between English and the Oneida language. Walter Schuyler led the group in his dignified presence, setting a tone of respectful evaluation rather than casual tourism. James and Dr. Running Bear guided them through the partially completed spaces, explaining the planned displays and interpretive approaches. The underground chamber drew particular attention, with the elders examining both the artifacts and the preservation methods with careful scrutiny. Their feedback afterward was direct but constructive. Certain displays needed refinement to better reflect indigenous perspectives. Some terminologies required adjustment, and the repatriation process for sacred objects needed more prominence in the narrative. Most significantly, they proposed incorporating a regular schedule of cultural events where tribal members would share living traditions with visitors, demonstrations of craft storytelling sessions, and seasonal celebrations that would connect the historical artifacts to contemporary Oneida culture. "Your grandfather began a process of recognition and respect," Walter Schuyler told James as the meeting concluded. "But true healing requires ongoing relationship, not just preservation of objects from the past. The land remembers all who have lived upon it. The museum should reflect that continuity." The elders' words resonated deeply with James, crystallizing something he had been sensing but hadn't fully articulated. This project wasn't just about displaying artifacts or telling historical narratives. It was about acknowledging relationships to the land that stretched across centuries, and cultures creating space for those relationships to be honored and renewed. With the elders' input incorporated into the plans, the project entered its final development phase. The physical transformation of the barn neared completion, with its weathered exterior preserved while the interior had been completely reconfigured to accommodate exhibition spaces. The surrounding landscape was being carefully restored to include demonstration gardens, showcasing both indigenous and European agricultural techniques. As winter settled across the property, a new challenge emerged: balancing the museum's mission with the practical realities of operating a farm. The educational agricultural program had secured funding, but the remaining fields presented a dilemma. Leaving them fallow seemed wasteful, yet maintaining full-scale farming operations alongside the museum seemed unmanageable. It was Max who proposed an unexpected solution during a planning meeting. What if we leased the back 40 to the Peterson family? Their farm borders ours on the west, and they've been looking to expand for years. We keep the fields around the house and barn for the educational program, but the rest stays in production. Their lease payments could help support the museum operations. The proposal had merit. The Petersons were respected local farmers committed to sustainable practices. The arrangement would keep the land in agricultural use while providing additional income for the museum project. After consulting with legal advisors and the tribal council, James agreed to the plan, signing a 5-year lease agreement with appropriate provisions for archaeological oversight of any ground-disturbing activities. This compromise reflected the evolving vision for the property. Not a static museum or a purely commercial farm, but a living landscape where multiple uses and traditions could coexist respectfully. The Reed Family Agricultural and Cultural Heritage Museum would preserve the past while remaining economically viable for the future. As winter gave way to early spring, exhibition installation began in earnest. Display cases arrived and were carefully positioned according to the finalized design plans. Interpretive panels with bilingual text in English and Oneida were mounted on walls. Interactive elements were tested and refined. The underground chamber, now equipped with museum-grade climate control and security systems, was prepared as the centerpiece of the collection display. James found himself drawing on his design background in unexpected ways, creating visual identities for marketing materials, designing wayfinding systems for visitors, developing educational materials for school groups. His training, which had seemed wasted in corporate jobs, now found perfect application in creating engaging experiences that would connect visitors to the dual heritage of the land. Max, too, found a new purpose. His community service hours evolved from obligation to engagement as he worked with the Tribal Council's education coordinator to develop authentic agricultural demonstrations. His knowledge of traditional farming methods, from seed selection to harvest techniques, provided a perspective that neither academic researchers nor cultural specialists could offer. One morning, James found his uncle working with a group of tribal youth demonstrating how to prepare soil for planting using methods his father and grandfather had taught him. The genuine respect with which these young people listened to Max, a man who months earlier had been caught stealing their cultural heritage, suggested healing that extended beyond legal requirements. With the opening date set for early summer, the final months of preparation brought both intensifying pressure and growing excitement. Marketing materials were distributed to regional schools, tourism offices, and cultural organizations. A small staff was hired and trained to manage daily operations. Special events were planned for the inaugural season, including workshops, lectures, and cultural demonstrations. Throughout this process, James balanced the demands of the museum project with efforts to rebuild his design career. The farm's reliable internet connection allowed him to take on freelance projects for clients who shared his values of cultural respect and environmental stewardship. This additional income supported him while the museum established its financial footing, and the creative work provided intellectual stimulation that complemented the hands-on nature of the farm project. 1 week before the scheduled opening, a final inspection by the Tribal Council and museum certification officials found only minor adjustments needed. The project had transformed from Raymond Reed's private passion to a professional quality educational institution that would serve both the local community and visitors from across the region. On the eve of the grand opening, James stood alone in the underground chamber, surrounded by the artifacts his grandfather had so carefully preserved. The space looked dramatically different now, professionally lit, securely housed in museum-quality cases, interpreted with thoughtfully designed panels. Yet the essential spirit of Raymond Reed's vision remained intact: respect for the objects, their makers, and the stories they told about this particular piece of land. Heavy footsteps on the ladder broke his reverie. Max descended carefully, looking uncomfortable in the new button-down shirt he'd purchased for tomorrow's ceremony. For a moment, uncle and nephew stood in silence, taking in what they had created from the chaos of mistrust and theft that had marked their early relationship. Dad would have been proud of this, Max said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Not just the fancy displays, but what it represents. I spent years thinking he was wasting time and money on a hobby when he was actually building something important, something that will outlast all of us. James nodded, understanding that his uncle's words represented a kind of personal reckoning, acknowledgement of both his father's vision and his own failure to recognize its value until nearly too late. The realization stirred a complimentary reflection in James how close he had come to selling the farm, immediately missing entirely the legacy his grandfather had intended for him to continue. The morning of the opening ceremony dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to animate the tribal and state flags flanking the museum entrance. By 9 o'clock, the parking area began filling. Tribal council members and their families, local officials, representatives from regional museums and universities, neighbors and townspeople, curious about the transformation of the old Reed barn. Dar Running Bear arrived early, reviewing last-minute details with the staff. Her usual professional composure was enhanced by formal attire that signified the cultural importance of the occasion. A beautifully beaded jacket worn over a conservative business suit, traditional jewelry complementing her modern eyeglasses. At 10 o'clock precisely, Walter Schuyler opened the ceremony with a traditional Oneida blessing, acknowledging the ancestors who had lived on this land, the natural world that sustained them, and the ongoing relationships between people and place that the museum would help nurture. His words, first in Oneida and then translated to English, set a tone of reverence and celebration. James spoke next, his initial nervousness giving way to genuine emotion as he described his grandfather's journey from farmer to cultural preservationist and his own parallel journey from disconnected urban professional to steward of a dual heritage. He acknowledged the theft and recovery of artifacts not as a scandal to be hidden, but as a lesson in the ongoing challenges of cultural preservation. Every object in this collection has a story that begins long before it was made and continues through its discovery, documentation, and even its theft and recovery, he told the assembled crowd. By understanding these complete stories, the beautiful and the difficult parts alike, we honor both the original creators and those who have worked to preserve their legacy. The Running Bear followed with remarks about the academic and cultural significance of the collection, emphasizing the collaborative process that had shaped the museum and the ongoing partnership it represented between the Reed family, the Oneida Nation, and the broader community. The formal ribbon cutting gave way to guided tours of the exhibitions. Visitors expressed genuine appreciation for both the professional quality of the displays and the thoughtful integration of multiple perspectives in the interpretive materials. The underground chamber proved especially popular, with many commenting on the powerful experience of seeing artifacts displayed near where they had been discovered. Not everyone responded positively. Some local farmers muttered about giving away our heritage when they thought James couldn't hear. A small group of antiquities collectors stood apart from the main crowd, their expressions suggesting discomfort with the museum's strong message about ethical preservation. One elderly resident complained loudly that turning good farmland into a tourist attraction was a waste of resources. These dissenting voices were a reminder that changing established attitudes would take time. The museum wouldn't immediately heal centuries of cultural displacement or transform every visitor's perspective. But it created a space for dialogue, recognition, and the slow work of building mutual understanding. As the day progressed, James found moments to observe visitors interacting with different aspects of the museum. Children were drawn to the hands-on elements, grinding corn with traditional tools, examining replica artifacts. They could touch freely, planting heritage seeds in the demonstration garden. Elders from the tribe engaged deeply with the cultural exhibits, sometimes offering additional context or personal connections to younger family members. Most unexpectedly, moving was watching Max guide a group of local farmers through the agricultural history section. His knowledge of traditional farming methods and the specific history of the Reed property transformed him from reluctant participant to engaged educator. The community service hours mandated by his plea agreement had evolved into something that appeared to give him authentic purpose. By late afternoon, as the formal events concluded and visitors began to depart, James found a quiet moment with Dr. Running Bear on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the last golden light play across the fields where so many generations had worked the land. "This is just the beginning, she said, gesturing toward the museum where a few visitors still lingered. The real work happens now, building educational programs, hosting community events, continuing research on the collection, sustaining what your grandfather started. The weight of this ongoing responsibility settled on James's shoulders, not as a burden, but as a purposeful challenge. He nodded, already thinking about next steps, expanding the interpretive trails, developing curriculum materials for school groups, creating seasonal programming that would bring visitors back throughout the year. The financial realities remained daunting. Operating costs would exceed admission revenues for the foreseeable future, requiring creative fundraising and grant writing. The property's maintenance needs wouldn't diminish with time. Building a sustainable model that balanced cultural mission with economic viability would require ongoing innovation and community support. Yet the foundation had been laid. The museum had transformed from Raymond Reed's solitary vision to a collaborative institution with strong partnerships and community investment. The cultural heritage preserved in the collection was now accessible to both the descendants of its creators and the broader public. The land itself was being honored in ways that acknowledged its complex, layered history. 1 year later, James stood at the edge of the Northfield, watching a group of Oneida youth working alongside local agricultural students to plant a traditional Three Sisters garden. Corn, beans, and squash growing together as they had for centuries before European settlement. The museum had just welcomed its 10,000th visitor, an unexpected level of success for a rural cultural institution in its first year. The museum itself had evolved through that initial year of operation. Exhibitions had been refined based on visitor feedback, new artifacts had been added, as and archaeological survey work continued on outlying portions of the property, and the educational programs had expanded to include regular workshops on both indigenous and early European craft techniques. Most significantly, the museum had become a genuine community gathering place. Local schools brought students for history and cultural lessons. Community groups used the meeting spaces for events, and the seasonal festivals organized jointly with the tribal nation drew visitors from across the region. Max had completed his community service hours months ago, but continued to work at the museum now as a paid staff member, overseeing the agricultural demonstrations and maintenance of the grounds. His knowledge of the land and its seasonal rhythms had proven invaluable, and visitors responded to his authentic connection to the farming heritage being preserved alongside the archaeological collection. The recovery of stolen artifacts had largely concluded. 16 of the 17 items Max had sold had been recovered, along with 13 of the 15 pieces Jim Henderson had removed. The remaining 3 artifacts were likely lost permanently, having been sold to international buyers beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. Rather than hiding this loss, the museum acknowledged it openly, maintaining empty spaces in the relevant displays with explanatory text about the missing items and the ongoing challenges of cultural heritage protection. These gaps in the collection served as powerful reminders of what was at stake in preservation work. James himself had found an unexpected balance in his life. While the museum remained his primary focus, he had gradually rebuilt his design career, working with clients who valued cultural authenticity and environmental responsibility. The skills that had seemed wasted in corporate jobs found purpose in creating materials for indigenous cultural initiatives, small, sustainable farms, and educational institutions. He split his time between the renovated farmhouse and a small apartment in the nearest city where he could access design resources and maintain connections to urban creative communities. This dual existence, rural steward and urban professional, allowed him to bridge worlds in ways that strengthened the museum's mission and reach. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower as James walked the property, mentally noting maintenance needs and potential improvements. The old oak tree, where he'd built a tree house as a child, now anchored an outdoor classroom space. The creek that marked the eastern property line featured newly installed interpretive signs explaining its significance in both indigenous lifeways and early European settlement patterns. Near the original excavation site, where his grandfather had found the first significant artifacts, a simple granite marker had been installed, acknowledging Raymond Reed's contribution to cultural preservation. The inscription, developed in consultation with the tribal council, read, "In honor of Raymond Reed, 1944-2022, who recognized that the stories buried in this soil belong to all who have called this land home." James paused at this marker, as he often did during his walks around the property. The journey from his grandfather's first discovery to the thriving cultural institution that now occupied the farm, had spanned decades and overcome numerous obstacles. Yet the essential vision had remained constant, respectful stewardship of both cultural heritage and agricultural tradition, recognition of the interconnected stories of all who had lived on this land. A movement near the tree line caught his eye, a doe and her fawn emerging cautiously from the woods to graze in the evening light. James remained still watching this continuation of natural cycles that had persisted through centuries of human habitation and change on this land. In that moment of quiet observation, he felt a profound connection to his grandfather. Not the distant figure of childhood memories, but the man whose passion and principles had created a legacy that would endure for generations. Raymond Reed had understood something essential about this place, that the land holds memories deeper than any single family's claim, that proper stewardship means acknowledging all who have come before. The museum they had created together, across time and despite intervening obstacles, wasn't just about displaying artifacts or preserving buildings. It was about recognizing that the truest ownership of any place comes through respectful care and honest acknowledgement of its complete history. As twilight gathered and the first stars appeared overhead, James turned toward the farmhouse, its windows glowing with welcoming light against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new challenges, new opportunities to share the stories this land had accumulated across centuries. The work of preservation was never truly complete, each generation adding its own layer to the ongoing narrative of people and place. Walking back through fields his family had tended for generations, fields that had supported indigenous communities for centuries before them, James Reed carried forward his grandfather's understanding that the most valuable treasures are not those we claim for ourselves, but those we preserve as a gift to the future. The ground beneath his feet had yielded artifacts that connected past to present, had revealed histories long buried beneath seasons of planting and harvest. But the most important discovery had been the recognition that the land itself was the true repository of memory, holding in its soil and streams, its trees, and open spaces the accumulated stories of all who had lived upon it. As he reached the farmhouse porch, James paused for one last look at the museum building, silhouetted against the evening sky. What had once been a weathered barn leaning slightly to the left had been transformed into something that would outlast him just as it had outlasted his grandfather. A place where memory was preserved, where multiple histories were acknowledged, where the past informed the present and inspired the future. In honoring what lies beneath, James Reed had discovered what truly supports what stands above the interconnected narratives of people, and placed the acknowledgement of multiple truths existing in the same space, and the commitment to preserving those truths not for personal gain, but for the generations yet to come.